Welcome to Movie Bounce with Mike and Harry, where we'll bounce from movie to movie.
From actor, writer, director, any which way.
Who knows where we'll bounce to next? Hi, everybody, it's Mike here.
It's Harry.
And it's a special holiday episode of Movie Bounce. One of 9, actually. And what's this episode about, Harry, today? This is December 17th. What episode could this possibly be covering?
So if it's December 17th and we anticipate unwrapping 9 gifts, then there's only one movie series that can have 9 movies in it.
Halloween.
And so, yeah, we're totally doing Halloween for Christmas. Absolutely. No. So starting today and for the next 9 days, we will be discussing Star Wars.
Well, that's good. Because Halloween around Christmas, I don't know how that would have worked. But Star Wars, man, I'm excited about this. I mean, that's a lot. This is a lot to go into. I mean,
well, we're doing it for the holidays. We're doing it for the fans and the listeners. Because honestly, I don't know if we'd ever bounce to the official trilogy. So this is a great time to get into it.
We're bouncing into it, and it's going to take us a long time to bounce out of it. But it's going to be a fun time. I couldn't think of a better way, a better franchise to just get the holiday season started off on the right foot. But it's December 17th now, and for every day leading up to Christmas, we're going to be talking about one of these films. And I'm excited, Harry. Are you excited?
I'm excited, and I'm just thinking, well, like, we really committed to this, so we've got to pull it off now.
Yes, absolutely. Now, here's the thing. Where were you the first time you saw Star Wars?
So there's definitely a picture of me as a toddler in, like, footsie pajamas, standing in front of the TV in my parents' house, watching, I believe it's A New Hope, because it's C-3PO's head on the TV. And it's one of those amazing classic TVs that it's like built into the furniture. So that's probably where I first was to see this movie.
Okay. See, I feel like everyone has to know where they were the first time they saw this movie. I think that there's something so magical about it, and I hate to use that word magical, but I will, is that the first time you see a lightsaber, it's just like, whoa, what's that? At least I'm speaking from my own experience because I was around 5 years old when I saw it. And I just only paid attention to Sharks on TV, Ghostbusters, and Top Gun. Those are the movies on rotation at my house when I was growing up at the age of 5. But when those were on rotation, those were the only movies I'd see over months. So I thought, oh, that's it. There are no more movies I have to check out. And then eventually I saw a little bit of A New Hope on TV. And when I first caught that glimpse of a lightsaber, I was just like, oh, what's that? And then I was just like, is that real? Like, being that young, I went, is that a thing? Do we live in a world where this exists to some degree? And then I was engaged with it for a few minutes, and then I moved on, and I just went to playtime and stuff like that. So I only got a glimpse of Star Wars. It took me a while till I fully watched committed the whole 2 hours to it. And even when I did, I think even though I got a glimpse of it when I was 5, I really didn't give it its full attention until much later on, many years later.
Yeah, same here, actually. You know, it's so funny that you mentioned that because, again, when I was very young, it was always kind of around in my consciousness because my brother being older, he had all of the old toys and whatever, storybooks, etc. So I was familiar with a lot of the characters and a lot of the visuals. But I didn't really know the story until much later, until I was like probably 13 or 14. And it's at that point, I would say, like, and I like the original trilogy, but the movies, especially if you're a little kid, they're kind of boring. You know, there's a lot of talking, there's a lot of scenes that, you know, are character development focused, that are driving the story. And as an adult, they're not necessarily boring. But as a kid, man, like, if you go from a scene with, like, a bar with all these weird aliens, and then, you know, 5 minutes later, you're in a spaceship and they're just talking about the Force, that's kind of hard if you're 5 or 6.
Well, isn't even the first, 30 minutes tough to get into when you're a kid? Because it's a slow beginning, is it not?
Yeah, the beginning is definitely slow. Look, the movie is very good because it's a great adventure movie. It's that whole hero's journey kind of cookie cutter approach, and there's nothing wrong with that. But that's something as a kid you don't really learn to recognize, and in fact, this might even be your first experience with that kind of story. But I agree, yeah, like a lot of that setup is very dry. There's a lot of scenes like when Darth Vader is at like the conference room table with those other like generals and stuff. Like it's cool as an adult because you get the tension and there's a lot of dynamic there. As a kid, you're just like, yeah, I want to see another robot.
Right, I know, and it's funny because the movie was made in the '70s. So even now that I think about it, I'm like, how could they have possibly made this more engaging for kids at the time? Because in the '70s, there were movies like Easy Rider. There was, like they were like this movie was such had such a huge cultural impact. Obviously, as you've heard the stories when it opened that opening day, it came out the same day as Sorcerer from William Friedkin, who had previously made The Exorcist, and just blew that movie away. But the fact that it was just there was nothing that came out. It's just still kind of hard to process. Like nothing previously that really had such a huge stamp. I think that had such an impact. And like this is like the first real. I mean, besides Jaws that came out a few years prior to, this was like the next big blockbuster. But yeah, there wasn't anything kind of like this prior to that, right?
No, and you know why? Because I think, up until this point, and this movie wears its influences clearly on its sleeve, whether it's Buck Rogers or Kurosawa movies or what have you. But it's really the first movie to kind of take all of that, process it together, and just put it out on screen, kind of like really with very little explanation. Like now these movies, they're so focused on world building and they want to explain a lot of stuff and all of these things. This movie just put it out there and it kind of let you, the viewer, fill in the blanks with your imagination. And I think that's really a big part of why it was so captivating and why people just absolutely loved it.
Well, and a lot of that is due to, of course, George Lucas's imagination and the focus that he had on this. And we don't have to talk too much about what happened going on in the making of this film, but not many people knew, obviously, if he was really onto something here. But the vision that he did have, and what that created, and what that everything else that snowballed afterwards, like the inspiration, how other filmmakers were inspired by this movie, what he was inspired by, THX, right? With THX, have you seen that movie, by the way?
I have, actually. Yes, I did see that
What are your
movie.
thoughts about that film?
I mean, I think it's pretty good. It's not... I don't like it as much as maybe I should, or maybe it deserves to be liked. Like, it's not bad at all, and I think it's pretty good, but it didn't resonate with me. Like, I could list 5 other weird sci-fi movies that I like more, but yeah.
Right, and Lucas was also inspired by Dune, right?
Probably. I'm not super sure about that, actually. But I wouldn't be surprised.
Okay, so like the question I always that I'm thinking of right now is that like what led to this? I mean, this was such a huge movie for its time, and still today that it is so treasured. I mean, and also to have other films that follow through and really appease the fans as much as it did. It's still something that's weird where it didn't speak to me as much when I was 5. And the question I had is, when this was packed opening weekend, I don't even know, but were there kids going to see this movie opening weekend? It probably took a long time for little kids to get embracing this film. I figure like it's mostly teenagers and like early 20s, 30s adults that checked it out initially. And then just word caught on, and it just grew a bigger and bigger audience. And then kids got eventually, engaged with the film as well, because this was so. I mean, yeah, it's still shocking how this came to be, as well as the impact it has made on film.
Yeah, we often forget about its lasting legacy because we often view these movies in the context of the sequels, right? All of the Star Wars movies that came after it. But it definitely kind of reconfigured movies overall, right? Like in terms of special effects, in terms of, building franchises, merchandise. Like it just has so much of an impact that, you can't forget that.
Like when I look at it now, as opposed to when I was a kid, I think actually, let me backtrack a little. Let me go back a little bit. When I was 5, I got my first glimpse of it. Years later, maybe I was like 9, 10. Then I was like, I had my brother said you should watch the whole movie. And then that was like kind of a chore for me. I'm like, all right, fine. And then I did, and then I was just like, okay, I'm all about it. And then I found out that there was an Empire Strikes Back. Like I didn't know that there was an Empire Strikes Back. Like when I was like, yeah, later on, like I was probably like eight or nine. I'm not kidding. And then when he told me about that, I'm like, oh well, I definitely want to see that. And then he's like, oh, but there's also Return of the Jedi. And I'm like, well, I need that right now. Like I basically marathon or binged them like right after I saw A New Hope. I had to see, and especially the way those films end. And we won't go into those now. But that was the one I was the most engaged with it, and it was this experience for me that was actually tough to recreate because I have watched the trilogy since, but then my kind of relationship with them have changed through the years. I think the most engaged I was ever with I ever was with this trilogy was when I was like 9 or 10 when I saw it on that little marathon, and it was an experience. But what appealed to me most, and we're going to get into this a little bit, might be different from what what appeals to most fans. So that's an interesting thing of what I've learned about myself when I've had to watch the the prequels and the films that have followed and came out recently, and also to let the listeners know, Harry and I and our friends, we went to watch obviously the films that were released over the last few years, every other year, the episode 7, 8, and 9. When they were released in December. Like, it's opening day, I think, every day, right, Harry?
That's right. It became kind of a bit of a holiday tradition for us.
Right. So last year we're like, this is it. It's going to be a long time till we get another one of these. I mean, it became an experience that now it's like, oh well, we're not going to have that for a little while. Until I think Taika Waititi, I guess he might be working on a new trilogy or whatever, but they've got The Mandalorian today. So it's interesting to see kind of the journey from 1977 up until today and how the journey with these films that I don't think, they're never going to go away. Like, you're never going to hear people getting, even as they make more and more content out there, it's never going to be as diluted as other franchises, I feel. Or do you disagree?
Well, I feel like Disney is going to try its best to dilute it, not necessarily in a bad way.
How would we? Okay, let's imagine a bad way. If they had Rob Schneider in one of these roles, if they recast,
but I think it's more about just constantly creating content. Like, they stuck to, like, what was it, like every other year, or every 2 years,
right,
and which was impressive. Part of that was around the tradition, but now we've got TV shows, and the sky's the limit. If they just decide, like, they put the brakes on all of those anthology movies right after Solo, but they may decide, like, well, The Mandalorian's doing amazing, like, let's get that Obi-Wan TV show going, and, like, why don't we have a Darth Vader TV show? So time will tell how they choose to leverage the franchise.
I enjoyed the most from the original trilogy. We're going to go into the other trilogies as well, but that's what kind of my thing is. Maybe it's not a purist thing, but I feel like if this came from George Lucas's mind, I kind of want to see those stories from him. And I'm not sure how confident I am in other writers producing all this content, as you said. So that's, I think, my biggest hesitation, and the reason why I also don't kind of embrace as much like The Mandalorian that's now on Disney Plus. And I've actually just recently watched the first episode, and just kind of going back on what I just said, the one thing that we talk a lot about in many of these episodes is confidence within the narrative. And the thing that I was the most shocked about The Mandalorian is just what I think I only made it in 20 minutes so far within the first episode, is there's an incredible amount of confidence within that show. So, which surprised me, because we don't see a lot of that in most TV shows and also most movies. Because, I feel like you can almost tell when a film is like almost toyed with by a committee. You can tell how the narrative gets screwed with. A lot due to the editing, it percolates, and it's the point where it disconnects with the viewer most times. And I have to say that some of the movies within the Star Wars franchise, actually, that has happened. Whether it be from George Lucas or not, we'll obviously go into that.
So it's funny because you mentioned confidence, and I'll kind of use that as a kicking off point. So much of this movie was just based on this particular vision, which, and I'm not saying this as a negative or criticism at all, it was George Lucas taking all of those things that he loved as a kid that inspired him, adventure stories, swashbuckling movies, all that stuff, Errol Flynn, and he just said, like, well, I'm going to take this, I want to make a movie in this style, I'm going to, put it in space. I'm going to be super imaginative, and I'm just going to go with it. And that's what's really so amazing about this movie. It was just, it wasn't made by a committee, and it certainly wasn't really too much like anything that came before it. It took a lot of inspiration and a lot of influences, but it repackaged that in ways that I don't think anyone expected.
It's kind of amazing that he had done that, like create this amalgamation of all that, everything that he kind of loved as a kid, and that let his imagination run wild. And it's still hard to process that the studio had him do what he wanted to do and execute it, And I know that he's said since that he wishes he had the special effects in at that time to truly have his imagination really being up there on the screen. And he's toyed obviously with it since. But I feel like it's unfortunate that since then, it's rare. I mean, I think we do have more filmmakers that want to kind of have the similar intention, but studios do kind of mess with that, and they don't. The final product is incredibly underwhelming, if not a mess.
You know what? Let me ask you a question about that. So, would you say that that's kind of the curse of Star Wars? Because Star Wars became so successful that the studios are now like, well, we want to recapture that lightning in a bottle, and we're going to scrutinize everything now, and we're going to compare it to that.
Like they see a huge moneymaker, and it's like it's like striking gold, and everyone's surrounded by the next opportunity. Could be. I mean, there's also the fact that there's that reason, but then there's also the reason of when they've had other filmmakers, run with the budget, have as much fun with the budget. And then it turns out to be a huge flop. There's the concern. There's the whole, you got too many cooks in the kitchen, basically operating out of fear. Because they don't want, there's a lot at stake. So it could have been, a huge catalyst. But then you can say the same thing about Jaws. And Jaws came out previously. Jaws was a nightmare to film. It ended up being a huge success.
No, sure. But, getting back to the movie, it's really great because you have clearly defined characters in their roles, and someone might say, well, they're cookie cutter and they're cliched, but there's nothing wrong with that.
Who says that? Did they say they're cookie? Is that a thing?
Wouldn't you say that? You've got the damsel in distress, you have the rogue, you have the naive, adventurer, and you have kind of his wise mentor. It's completely just cliched. It's completely archetypical, and there's nothing wrong with that, because if you pull that stuff off well, there's a reason why it's a success. There's a reason why that people respond to it, because it is good. It is a good equation for sure. And this movie definitely follows that. You've got this naive adventurer, Luke Skywalker, and you, the audience, kind of see things through his eyes, and you're experiencing things for the first time just as he is, and then he's kind of educated by Obi-Wan Kenobi, who's trying to teach him the ways of the Force, and then you've got Han Solo, who's, very jaded and cynical, and he's, throwing that in there, and Luke is just all processing this as we are as the viewer. That's great. If it's not broke, don't fix it, and if you do it right, you're going to have an amazing story and a great movie behind that.
You mentioned the cliches and the character archetypes. I feel like that didn't even cross my mind. I didn't look at it or analyze it that way because they're just so well defined. They're so the way the film, because I look at other films like that. Obviously you go, oh, here we go. Here's like you said, the damsel in distress. And yes, that is probably one of the first things that does come across my mind. I think that if any character would be that character. But I think it's just because of the actors. And I don't think Mark Hamill obviously gives a good performance. This is not a good performance. But I think that Harrison Ford, it's just his performance is just kind of jumps out of the screen in many ways. I don't know why. It's just like these characters are so embedded in my mind that I couldn't even think of looking at any of these, anything as a cliche. There is the whole idea that, we know that Lucas wanted us to be a space soap opera. That was it in his mind. But just in terms of execution, it just transcended any cliche you might think you have in your mind, to your point. But that's why I didn't even come across my mind to even look at it that way.
Yeah, I think that's fair, but I think if you were 30 when the movie came out, you would
cynical.
see the cliches.
Yeah,
right?
you'd be more
You'd
cynical.
be like, oh, this guy he's basing his performance off of like Humphrey Bogart or like, James Dean or something like, I'm clearly pulling those out of my ass.
Right.
But the idea is that, I think about like people who saw that much older and who had experienced more cinema and more drama and radio serials, and they would probably say it's derivative, right?
Right.
But for a completely different generation like ours, like we just really clung to it.
To your point, like I imagine like This Day Open the Same Day as Sorcerer, the fans of Sorcerer that love that movie looked at this going, what, are you kidding me? This is the movie that's successful? So I can see those people there as well. But what did you say would be, if you think of from your perspective, once you've watched Star Wars, what are like 3 things that really stick out in your mind that resonate the most once this film is over with, once you're moving on, after you've seen it?
Yeah, so first of all, it's just the imagination. So, the story is fine, but for me, I just love looking back at all the stuff that you don't know about, that you don't get the story behind, whether it's the aliens in the cantina, whether it's like, the robots, the starships, like all of these things that are just there as window dressing that, in other movies, that would be the entire movie. That would be the entire plot, is to talk about this one bar or whatever. So that would be part of it. The second is just that very traditional and comforting adventure arc where, it ticks all the boxes, where you've got, the characters kind of going out of their comfort zone, learning, adventuring, eventually succeeding, through the help of their friends. Han Solo learns the value of friendship, all of this stuff. Like, again, I say, done right, it's a very satisfying story. And then finally, like, it's just the idea that there's this larger kind of epic that's there for you. Like, you want to know more about these characters, and there is kind of this sense that you will see them again. And I understand when the movie came out, it wasn't necessarily that a sequel was guaranteed, but the movie doesn't necessarily have a definitive end because it ends with, well, Darth Vader is still out there. This is just one victory, but the war still rages on. So I like that it teases more, and that's important too.
Well, now I have it on the background. I actually have the movie playing, and it's that scene with Jabba the Hutt and Han Solo where Han Solo steps on his tail.
Well, that's the special.
You can see a huge difference between what's filmed in 1977 and what's filmed in 19. And it's 1997, right? So these upgraded versions are just, they stand out no matter how much you try to polish it up. There's a huge contrast here, which is it takes me out of the film. But yeah, I think that for me, what really mainly resonates for me is Han Solo's character. I am not necessarily the one on board this whole journey. I'll go along with it. I think I was more on board when I was 9 watching the film just for the adventure. And, even before I watched this movie in its entirety, like I've watched the Indiana Jones films, so I was more familiar with Harrison Ford from Raiders of the Lost Ark. And for some reason, I related more to that than the Star Wars trilogy, because it was just, with the Force and everything like that, it just seemed a little bit too science fiction-y, and I guess I didn't embrace science fiction films as much as a kid. So what resonated the most was mostly Han Solo's character, that defiance within this world to some degree, that he didn't give too much of a shit, and I wasn't so much. I think I like Luke, but for some reason I of course kind of side with Han Solo in this movie, and Chewbacca, and obviously not C-3PO as much, nor Luke. So that's kind of what I gravitated towards, and some of the special effects, sure. And I loved, Darth Vader. I mean, you needed a villain with that weight. So I was looking at all that. I wasn't even looking into the subtext. I wasn't even thinking that much into the Force. But when I look at them now, I do think I look at them more like that cynic that you're referring to. It's hard for me now to strap in and really be 100% totally engaged, totally on board with it. And it's a challenge for me because I kind of question, like, wow, is it something I can't get back to? Is it like, is the same thing going to happen to me if I rewatch Ghostbusters,
No, certainly. I totally get that. I think, you're coming more from just, and again, this is kind of the main driver of our opinions, I think, when we talk about movies. You have much more of a movie-focused background, where for me, it's movies are just something that you watch, and like I don't compare. When I was a kid, I wasn't comparing Star Wars with Ghostbusters. Like I was just kind of taking them on individually. So I totally get that.
Yeah. But where do we want to go with the story? How will have you lead this into it? Because as much as I've watched the movie, again, I'm more paying attention to Han Solo here. But what do you love about the beginning, like the start of this film? What don't you like? What do you like? What works for you? You know, has anything changed since you watched as a kid that you like less or more?
Yeah, you know what? I think for me, it's about how the movie is it just takes you in the middle of things. It kind of starts in the middle of the story,
Right.
which I like because again, you need to have that disorientation so you can kind of have that affinity with Luke Skywalker because he also is disoriented and he's being pulled in too. So it begins with the attack on, that rebel ship and, immediately you see C-3PO and R2-D2, which they're just kind of involved in the adventure almost as side characters, which I believe is a callback to certain Kurosawa movies, and certainly you could even, kind of look at like them as somewhat like Greek chorus. I'm not sure if that's 100% true, but they're kind of there and they just happen upon these adventures. And they take you kind of through the first part of the movie. We finally meet Luke, and then he kind of takes the yoke of trying to understand what's all going on. And that's kind of what I liked about it because it's important to be disoriented in a way where you're not confused. You're just really captivated by what's happening.
I mean, you bring up a good point. Like, I feel like I engage the most with stories where you are just thrown right in the action. That it's not just set up. It's just the storyteller is not looking for the most perfect setup, starting from the very beginning, and there's just more urgency set in, and it gets your attention 100%. I mean, we respond the most to like, oh, what's happening? There's a problem right in front of us. So if you're in the movie, from minute one it starts like that. That is incredibly exhilarating from my perspective.
Yeah, it's a very effective way of telling a story, and especially if you're looking to tell a story that is pretty traditional in its form, then that's a great way to do it because you kind of you put the audience on their back foot, and then eventually you ease them into probably a more familiar template, but you're not doing it so obviously from the beginning.
Right. Yeah, I actually prefer those. I can't think of other movies off the top of my head that do it, but I just know that I do kind of engage with those films the most. Okay. So now going into the characters. We're not going to go into the behind the scenes stuff. We know Alec Guinness hated this. Did he hate this role?
He hated it. We know we could have gotten, a ton of other amazing Han Solos. I just want to mention, it could have been Kurt Russell. It could have been Nick Nolte. It could have even been Steve Martin. But we got Harrison Ford. And
I think all of them. I would love to see all of them. I think, but we got the right one. No, you're right.
We got a good one for sure.
Yeah. But Luke Skywalker.
He wasn't my favorite character. Han Solo obviously was. I think Mark Hamill did a great job with the role that he was given. He was supposed to play this kind of naive, whiny character who's growing into the hero that he's going to become.
Not something's kind of off with that for me. But again, it doesn't matter as much because I'm kind of having more fun with the other characters. With R2-D2, C-3PO, and of course Chewbacca rounding it all out. It's that supporting cast that really elevates the main characters here. And that dynamic, I think, when I saw the lightsabers as a kid, that engaged me. What pulled me in was the dynamic between the three characters. Right before, I didn't start this movie from the beginning. Like you're talking about, this movie starts when you're thrust right into the middle of things. Well, I was thrust right in the middle of this movie. With that scene with the trash compactor, that banter between all three, that also spoke volumes. That's what had me go along for the journey. I thought that was a lot of fun.
Yeah, and it's an adventure movie with a lot of old-fashioned devices and conventions in it, but it was made in '77, so it has a lot of that cool kind of banter and that kind of more rough around the edges vibe, which is why I think the movie is just succeeds so well because it doesn't have that polish, and it doesn't have that polish in the performances, in the characters, in the world it presents. You often hear about people saying how it's kind of this dirty, used world where sci-fi beforehand was always just beautiful and clean and polished. So, that's something that really pervades the entire movie.
Yeah. I'm trying to think if this movie was miscast and you had like Christopher Walken playing Luke Skywalker, how this
Well,
movie
he was up in the running
for Han Solo, right? But I'm saying
yeah.
if it was miscast and it
Right.
was just like they were really off, like this could have been a huge mess. But I kind of would like to see something like that. I mean, yeah, I prefer. I'm glad this movie was made the year it did come out, in the '70s. Just the look of it, because I feel like if Lucas didn't make this film to the mid '90s, it would look awful. I feel like it just would look too polished almost. I like the kind of the worn kind of nature to the Millennium Falcon. I like the aesthetics pretty much. Whereas I think that when films try to do this later on in the '90s, it just didn't work as much. But then,
Right.
I think once those three characters meet up, I'm 100% on board. I'm like, ooh, the drama, all that ensues, and I'm with all of them. That was the through line for the movie, for the trilogy for me. Special effects, still, even as a kid, I wasn't totally impressed with the Millennium Falcon. I didn't, some of the visuals there when you go to Lightspeed, that worked for me. But it wasn't a film that I revisited as much as, say, Jaws or Ghostbusters or even Raiders of the Lost Ark. But I did really appreciate.
What I do want to mention, actually, which I think about often, is, and I don't know if you've ever seen like some of the original trailers to this movie,
No.
but they were very kind of stark and kind of creepy. And it makes me think that like people didn't really know what to do with this movie from a marketing standpoint. And like it's like I definitely recommend you check them out if you can. Like they're just framing this movie like the opening line is like, what if this was happening like somewhere else, or like I always like I had seen them recently, like in the last 10 or 15 years, and to me, I just always thought it was odd.
That's interesting.
But what
I
the
never
reason,
saw
yeah,
that.
it's definitely worth checking out. But the reason why I bring it up is because it's a part of the movie that people took away from it, right? Like if you're the marketing team and obviously you're looking at this
No,
movie,
if you're the
and trying to
marketing
come-
team in the '70s where you're smoking your cigarettes, you're drinking.
Yeah, exactly. You're drinking heavily during
what
the
to throw
day.
on my desk?
Right, but you're not really getting the movie,
Right.
and like the trailers have almost like a dark, kind of sinister tone to it, and this movie does have that to a degree. There's some horrific imagery, whether it's like the guy getting his arm chopped off in the cantina, or just some kind of there's that one devil alien there too, and clearly Darth Vader is pretty sinister looking, so that's cool because the movie has so many facets, and it just really depends on how you want to view it.
I mean, I'm trying to imagine that trailer. I can imagine there are a lot of other films that were mismarketed as poorly as that. That sounds like a lot of fun to watch, and I'm sure.
Well, because also like I remember the trailer didn't necessarily have like even the sound effects were pretty stark, and it's hard to really evaluate the movie in that regard because the movie has been altered so many times. Like we focus a lot on the special edition, but even before the special edition, there was a lot of adjustments to the movie. So
What do you mean
when
by
I
that?
saw,
You mean for like
So-
TV?
so when the movie first came out, and I'm kind of freebasing here or freeballing, whatever you want to call it. Like in the opening crawl, it just said Star Wars. I don't even think it said A New Hope. And
Right.
I'm
It
almost
took a
certain it didn't
while,
say
wasn't it, until the
Yeah.
special edition came out where they committed to A New Hope? Am I wrong about
No, I think it was before then, but
Okay.
it definitely wasn't episode 4 when it was first released. But then later on, they added that. I think they touched up a little bit of the lightsabers because when the movie first came out, like I think everyone's lightsaber was like white, and then it wasn't until later that they kind of colored them a bit more. So again, there are way better experts at the the history of Star Wars than I am, but I think most people think that, oh, it was a special edition and he read it a lot. But George Lucas was kind of refining these movies bit by bit for quite a time before that.
Okay. I mean, in terms of, I'm not sure he's ever 100% satisfied with this movie, even to today.
Right.
Like that just might be a thing where it's just like, when do you let it go, and just go, I'm happy with it. Because I'm sure that today, even when I mention and I'm watching this on the Blu-ray, you can see the things that stand out. I'm sure that he watches it too and wishes he can totally redo and polish everything. And that's just, I don't even want to see that because, if even that came into fruition, it would just look, we'd be like, whoa, something's off about this.
It's interesting that we get around to this discussion. It's inevitable, but when you create something and you put it out into the world, on the one hand, I do want to say as a creator, you should be able to kind of go in and tweak it and do what you want. It is your creation. But on the other hand, it's kind of too late. Like, I think you do kind of need to let it go, and it's already out there. It's already being consumed. It's, if you were a chef and someone ate, your dish, you can't go back into their stomach and take it out.
Well, even if I just told you a story for 2 hours, I can't the next day. I can't.
By the way,
this happened, and then change this part, and then the moment is over. That story has been told. So it's just more of us kind of like, accepting that. And in many ways, his revamping this movie so many times is more of us just watching him trying to deal with this. And that could be a story in and of itself. And I think they probably made those movies. Charlie Kaufman probably made that movie.
Right.
But,
for me, it's all about, I guess there's two ways to look at this movie. You can look at it as a movie, period, and just, appreciate/evaluate it based on that, which I think we're kind of doing now. Or you can look at it as like a true Star Wars fan, and then you're looking at all the lore and all the history, and so you mentioned like if Han Solo shot first or not, and that becomes very important because there are ramifications throughout, whether it's additional movies or novels or whatever. For me, I did have a time where I really liked Star Wars a lot, and I was into all that stuff. I'm older now, and now I'm kind of just like, I definitely view them more as movies now, individually, than part of a larger franchise. So I just say, like, leave it as is,
I won't nitpick this movie. Obviously, I as much as I talk about how I engaged with it throughout my life, that's one thing. But even when I do rewatch it, and I have it on now, as I'm talking, I see, even though I have it on mute, I see the engagement between the characters. Like, I'm looking at Han Solo and Luke talking with 3PO and, R2-D2 and Chewbacca in the same frame. And then you've got everything around, the way everything looks. And how it kind of fires on all cylinders visually. And then within the character dynamics, it's just such a... There were so many things. Again, any of these areas, they could go horribly wrong. But it's like there's so many things that's done right within this movie that I'm like, even within a frame, there's so much that works. Just whether or not it all is going to land, really hit, really strike with the audience has been the biggest kind of challenge after these movies. And we will be talking about those following movies. And in the next episode on December 18th, we'll be starting with Empire Strikes Back.
Check us out there, and we're going to pick up this conversation.
Okay, see you then. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe to not miss a single bounce.
We'll catch you next time, and don't forget to leave reviews on iTunes, Spotify, and wherever you listen to Movie Bounce.